The sun hung low over the town of Cibola Springs like a copper coin pressed against dirty glass. The light came slanted and weary through the dust that never quite settled in that corner of West Texas, painting everything the color of old blood and yellowed bone. It was the third week of August in the year 1884, and the heat sat on the town like a hand pressed over a mouth, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to remember that somewhere beyond the mesquite and the alkali flats there existed a world that wasn't made entirely of thirst and waiting. The town itself consisted of two streets that crossed at right angles, forming a skeleton upon which hung the usual meat of frontier commerce. A general store with windows so filmed with grit they looked frosted. A livery stable that smelled of hay and horse sweat and the particular sadness of animals kept too long in one place. A bank that had been robbed twice in its 5-year existence and now kept its money in a safe so heavy it had cracked the floorboards beneath it. A hotel called the Ranger's Rest that had never housed an actual Texas Ranger, but whose proprietor believed in aspirational naming. And 3 saloons, because Cibola Springs had been founded by optimists who believed that men would always need places to forget themselves. At the western end of town stood the sheriff's office, a squat adobe structure with bars on the windows and a roof that leaked when it rained, which wasn't often. The sign above the door had faded to near illegibility, but everyone knew what it said because everyone had reason to pass by it eventually, whether to report a theft or settle a dispute, or spend a night in the cells waiting for tempers to cool and memories to fog. On this particular evening, as the sun continued its slow, burning descent, a rider appeared on the eastern road. He came from the direction of Fort Stockton, though whether that was where his journey had begun was impossible to say. Distance in that country worked strangely, swallowing men whole, and sometimes spitting them back out months later with new scars and old eyes. The rider moved at an unhurried pace, sitting his horse like a man who had long ago learned that rushing toward anything usually meant rushing toward trouble. From the porch of the general store, 3 men watched him come. They had been playing cards but had abandoned their game when the dust plume first became visible on the horizon. In Cibola Springs, the arrival of a stranger was entertainment enough to interrupt any activity short of eating or dying. The rider was tall in the saddle, though that might have been an illusion created by his posture. He wore a black duster despite the heat, and his hat was pulled low enough that his face existed only as a suggestion of features beneath the brim. His horse was a grey gelding, with the look of an animal that had covered serious ground and would cover more before its working days were done. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office. The 3 men on the porch of the general store exchanged glances, but said nothing. One of them, a freighter named Hoskins, who hauled goods between Cibola Springs and San Angelo, spat tobacco juice into the street and watched as the stranger dismounted with the careful movements of someone whose body had learned not to trust solid ground after too many hours in the saddle. The stranger tied his horse to the hitching post and stood for a moment looking at the sheriff's office door. Then he turned slightly and looked up the street, taking in the town with what appeared to be neither approval nor disapproval, but simply acknowledgement. His gaze passed over the 3 watchers on the porch without pausing, as if they were no more remarkable than the buildings behind them. Then he pushed open the door and went inside. Hoskins looked at his companions. One was a ranch hand named Tom Weber, who worked for the Circle 7 outfit north of town. The other was an older man called Parson, though whether that was his actual name or a nickname earned through excessive moralizing was a question no one had bothered to settle. "Well," Hoskins said. "Well," Weber agreed. Parson said nothing, but his fingers drummed against the arm of his chair in a pattern that suggested thinking. Inside the sheriff's office, the stranger found a man sitting behind a desk that was too large for the room, engaged in the delicate operation of rolling a cigarette. The man behind the desk was Sheriff Clayton Mercer, who had held his position for 6 years through a combination of competence, compromise, and the kind of weary practicality that frontier justice required. He was 43 years old and looked older in the way that men do when they have spent their lives mediating between what the law demanded and what circumstances allowed. Mercer looked up when the stranger entered, but did not stop rolling his cigarette. His fingers continued their practiced movements, while his eyes performed an assessment that was partly professional and partly instinctive, the kind of reading that could mean the difference between a peaceful resolution and bloodshed. The stranger closed the door behind him and removed his hat. He was younger than his bearing had suggested, perhaps 35, with dark hair worn longer than was fashionable, and a face that would have been handsome if not for the hardness around the mouth and eyes. He had a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his hairline, not fresh, but not old enough to have faded to silver. His hands hung at his sides in that particular way that men carried themselves when they had worn a gun long enough for it to become part of their body's understanding of space and balance. "Sheriff," the stranger said. His voice was quiet, almost soft, but it carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Help you with something?" Mercer sealed his cigarette and reached for a match. "Name's Lyle Garrett. I'm looking for a man who might have passed through here. Would have been maybe 2-3 weeks back." Mercer struck the match and lit his cigarette, buying himself a moment to think. The name Lyle Garrett meant nothing to him, but that in itself meant nothing. The frontier was full of men whose names were known in one place and nowhere else, famous in a radius of 50 miles and anonymous beyond it. "Lots of men pass through," Mercer said. "Most of them keep passing. What's this one look like?" "Tall. Taller than me. Sandy hair going grey. Walks with a limp on the left side, old injury. Might be calling himself Thompson, or Matthews, or maybe using his real name, which is Caleb Tate." Something shifted in Mercer's expression, just a small tightening around the eyes that someone less observant might have missed. Garrett did not miss it. "You know him," Garrett said. It was not a question. Mercer took a long pull on his cigarette and let the smoke out slowly. Outside, the light was failing rapidly the way it did in that country, the transition from day to night occurring not as a gradual dimming, but as a sudden draining of color from the world. "Might have seen someone fitting that description," Mercer said carefully. "What's your business with him?" "He killed my brother." The words hung in the air between them, simple and heavy. Mercer set his cigarette in a tin dish that served as an ashtray and leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "You law?" "Used to be. Deputy Marshal out of Fort Smith." "Not anymore. So this is personal." "This is personal." Mercer nodded slowly, processing this information and measuring it against what he knew and what he suspected and what he feared. In his 6 years as sheriff of Cibola Springs, he had learned that personal matters were often more dangerous than professional ones, because personal matters couldn't be reasoned with or bargained away. "The man I'm thinking of came through about 3 weeks ago, like you said. Stayed 2 nights at the hotel, kept to himself mostly, played some cards, didn't cause any trouble, paid in silver coin and left heading southwest." "He alone?" "Far as I could tell." Garrett absorbed this information without visible reaction. "Anyone talk to him much? Anyone he seemed friendly with?" Mercer hesitated, and in that hesitation, Garrett saw the shape of something withheld. "Sheriff, I didn't ride 200 miles to play games. Whatever you're thinking about not telling me, tell me." Mercer stubbed out his cigarette, though it was only half-smoked. "He spent some time talking to a woman named Sarah Calloway. She runs the boarding house on the north side of town, widow. Lost her husband to pneumonia 4 years back. She's a decent woman, and I won't have trouble brought to her door." "I don't make trouble for decent people," Garrett said. "Just the one who killed my brother." "Fair enough, but you should know something else." Mercer stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where the shadows had grown long and thick. "Tate, or whatever name he was using, he left here 3 weeks ago, but 4 days ago, Sarah Calloway's boy Went missing. Garrett went very still. Missing how? Went out to check some traps he'd set in the hills east of town. 14 years old, knows the country, responsible kid. Didn't come home that night. We organized a search, found his horse about 5 miles out, still saddled. No sign of the boy. No tracks to speak of. No blood. No indication of what might have happened. It's like he just stepped off the earth. You think Tate came back? I think I don't know what to think. Could be the boy had an accident and we just haven't found him yet. Could be he ran afoul of Comanche, though we haven't had trouble with them in months. Could be any number of things. But the timing sits wrong with me. Garrett moved to the window and stood beside Mercer, both men looking out at the gathering darkness. The street was emptying as people went home to their dinners and their lamps, abandoning the town to whatever came with nightfall. Why would Tate come back for the boy? Garrett asked. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know that he did. But you're asking about him, and the boy's missing, and I learned a long time ago that coincidences in this country are usually something else wearing a coincidence's hat. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened slightly, losing some of its hardness. Tell me about your town, Sheriff. Tell me who lives here and who matters and what I'm walking into. So Mercer told him. He told him about Cibola Springs, which had been founded 8 years earlier by a group of settlers who believed they had found good water and good land and a good place to build lives that might last longer than they did. He told him about the ranchers who worked the surrounding country, running cattle on lease land that the government pretended to control and the Comanche had only recently and reluctantly abandoned. He told him about the merchants and the farmers and the drifters who passed through looking for work or running from trouble or simply moving because moving was what they did. He told him about Sarah Calloway, who had come west with her husband and son, seeking a fresh start after some unnamed difficulty back in Missouri, and who had made a life for herself after her husband's death through stubbornness and hard work, and the kind of quiet dignity that made people want to help her even when she didn't ask. Her boarding house was small but clean, her cooking was good, and her son Daniel was the kind of boy who helped old Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries and didn't complain when asked to do chores. He told him about Marcus Finch, who owned the largest of the 3 saloons and most of the property on the south side of town, and who had political ambitions that everyone recognized and no one took seriously. Finch was a man who believed that wealth and influence were the same thing, and he was halfway right, which made him dangerous in small ways. He told him about Doc Brennan, who drank too much but still had steady hands when they were needed, and who carried the weight of all the people he hadn't been able to save in a profession where saving people was always a provisional and temporary achievement. He told him about his deputy, a young man named Charlie Rusk, who was eager and competent, but had never shot anyone and might fold if circumstances required it. He told him about the town's divisions and alliances, its old grievances and new tensions, the way that all communities in that time and place were held together by threads of necessity and habit and mutual dependence that could fray quickly when tested. And he told him about himself, though not in so many words. He told him through the way he spoke about the town, with the mixture of affection and frustration that came from being responsible for people who often didn't want to be protected, and sometimes resented the protection when it was offered. He told him through his wariness, his calculation, his attempt to understand what kind of man Lyle Garrett was and what kind of storm he might be bringing with him. When Mercer finished, Garrett nodded slowly. I'll need to talk to Mrs. Calloway, and I'll need to see where the boy disappeared. You can do both tomorrow. Sun's down now, and there's nothing to be seen in the dark that won't be there in the morning. Get yourself a room at the hotel, get a meal, get some rest. We'll start fresh at first light. Garrett looked like he might argue, but then something in his face shifted and he nodded. All right, but Sheriff, you should know something. Caleb Tate is not the kind of man who does things by accident. If he came back here, he came back for a reason. And if he took that boy, he took him for a reason too. Whatever that reason is, it won't be good. I figured as much, Mercer said. Question is, what do we do about it? We find him, and then I kill him." Mercer didn't respond to that. He walked back to his desk and picked up his hat. "Come on, I'll walk you to the hotel. You can tell me about your brother on the way." They left the office and stepped out into the night, which had settled over Cibola Springs like a blanket, warm and heavy and absolute. The stars were beginning to emerge, countless and cold and indifferent to everything happening below them. From one of the saloons came the sound of a piano being played badly, and from somewhere else the sound of a woman laughing, bright and brief, before being swallowed by distance. As they walked, Garrett told Mercer about his brother. His name had been James Garrett, and he had been a clerk in a store in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He had a wife and 2 children, and a life that was ordinary in the way that most lives are ordinary, marked by small pleasures and small disappointments and the daily work of existing in a world that required constant effort to navigate. He had never done anything wrong to anyone. He had never cheated or stolen or lied beyond the small social lies that make communal life possible. He had been, by all accounts, a good man in the unremarkable way that most good people are good. Then, one evening in February, Caleb Tate had walked into the store 15 minutes before closing time. The details of what happened next were unclear because James had been alone in the store and Tate was not inclined to explain himself. What was clear was that Tate had shot James Garrett twice, once in the chest and once in the head, had taken approximately $30 from the cash box and had walked out into the winter darkness and disappeared. The law had looked for him, but the law had other concerns and limited resources, and eventually the search had been abandoned. Not officially, but in the practical sense that mattered. The case had been set aside in favor of more pressing matters. Lyle Garrett had been working as a deputy marshal at the time, stationed in Indian Territory. When he heard about his brother's death, he had requested a leave of absence to help with the investigation. When that leave was denied, he had resigned his commission and begun looking for Tate on his own. That had been 4 months ago. I tracked him through Indian Territory, across the Red River into Texas, down through the hill country and out onto the plains, Garrett said as they walked. He moves careful, doesn't stay anywhere long, uses different names, but he makes mistakes, like anyone, pays for things with silver coins, always silver, has a fondness for rye whiskey, the expensive kind, and he talks to women, lonely women mostly, widows or women whose husbands are gone a lot, seems to seek them out. You think that's why he talked to Sarah Calloway? I think it's part of who he is. I've learned a lot about Caleb Tate these past months, Sheriff. More than I wanted to know. He's not just a killer. He's something else, something worse. He likes causing pain, but not the quick kind. He likes getting inside people's lives, learning their weaknesses, finding the exact place where he can do the most damage. They had reached the hotel. Through the windows, they could see the small lobby with its worn furniture and its portrait of some forgotten dignitary on the wall. The clerk, a thin man with glasses and the perpetually startled expression of someone who had been frightened once and never quite recovered, looked up as they approached the door. "One more thing," Garrett said, stopping before they went inside. "In Fort Smith, before he killed my brother, Tate spent 2 weeks in town. He talked to people, asked questions, learned about the community, and he spent time with a widow who ran a boarding house. Her name was Elizabeth Warren. She had a 14-year-old son." Mercer felt something cold move through him. What happened to the boy? He disappeared. Went out hunting one afternoon, never came back. They searched for a week, never found any trace of him. 2 days after the boy vanished, Tate killed my brother and left town. They stood in silence, the implication of the parallel hanging between them like smoke. Finally, Mercer said, "You think he takes the boys before he moves on? Some kind of pattern. I think he does something with them. I don't know what. No bodies have ever been found. But yes, I think it's a pattern. I think he picks a town, finds a vulnerable woman with a son about that age, wins her trust, and then before he leaves, he makes the boy disappear. Why? I don't know. Maybe to hurt the mother. Maybe because he enjoys it. Maybe for reasons we couldn't understand if he explained them to us. But Sheriff, if I'm right, Daniel Calloway might still be alive. If Tate kept to his pattern, he took the boy 4 days ago. That means he's been holding him somewhere, keeping him alive for some purpose. Which means there might still be time. Mercer took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and weariness. Time for what? We don't know where Tate is. We don't even know for certain he's in the area. No, Garrett agreed. But we know he'll come back? How do you know that? Because he's not finished yet. Taking the boy is only part of it. What comes next is worse. And he'll want to see it happen. Before Mercer could respond, they heard the sound of running footsteps. Both men turned to see Charlie Rusk, the young deputy, sprinting up the street with the panicked urgency of someone carrying bad news. He skidded to a stop in front of them, breathing hard. "Sheriff, you need to come quick. Someone's broken into the bank." Mercer and Garrett exchanged a glance. Then all 3 men started running toward the center of town, their boots raising small clouds of dust that hung in the still night air before settling back to earth. They found a crowd gathered in front of the bank, perhaps 20 people drawn by whatever combination of curiosity and concern makes people congregate around disaster. The bank's front door stood open, and light spilled out from inside, making the gathered townspeople look like actors on a stage. Marcus Finch, the saloon owner, pushed through the crowd when he saw Mercer. His face was flushed, whether from anger or the exertion of running or both. "Sheriff, someone's torn the place apart. The safe is still locked, nothing seems to be missing, but they went through every drawer, every cabinet, every damn piece of paper in there." Mercer moved past him and into the bank, Garrett following close behind. The interior was indeed chaos. Papers covered the floor like snow, drawers hung open, chairs were overturned. But Finch was right. The safe stood untouched, its heavy door still locked and secure. "When did this happen?" Mercer asked. "I had to be in the last hour," said a voice from behind them. They turned to find Harrison Webb, the bank's owner, a stout man in his 50s with the permanently worried expression of someone who had dedicated his life to the safekeeping of other people's money. "I locked up at 6 o'clock like always. Everything was in order then. I came back just now because I'd forgotten some papers I needed to review and found it like this." Mercer knelt down and picked up some of the scattered papers, examining them. Ledgers, correspondence, deeds, contracts, all the paper machinery that kept a frontier town's economy grinding forward. Nothing obviously missing, but everything disturbed, examined, searched through. "They were looking for something specific," Garrett said quietly, standing beside Mercer. "Not money. Information." "What kind of information?" Webb asked, his voice rising. "We're a small-town bank, Sheriff. We don't keep secrets here. We don't have any information that someone would break in to find." But Mercer was looking at Garrett, and Garrett was looking back, and between them passed an understanding that required no words. "Everyone out," Mercer said to the crowd, still pressed in the doorway. "Charlie, get them back. Mr. Webb, I'll need you to go through everything tomorrow in daylight and tell me if anything's actually missing. For now, let's lock this place up and go home." The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, the way crowds always do when the spectacle is over, but the possibility of more entertainment remains. Soon, only Mercer, Garrett, and Charlie Rusk stood in the street outside the locked bank. "It's him, isn't it?" Mercer said. "Tate. He's here in town right now. Or he was. But Sheriff, think about it. What would a man like Tate be looking for in a bank's records?" Mercer thought. Then his eyes widened slightly. "Property records, land deeds. He's looking for somewhere to hide. Or somewhere he's already hiding. Somewhere isolated, somewhere no one would think to look. An old homestead, an abandoned claim, something off the books or forgotten." Charlie Rusk, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "There's a place. Used to be the Crawford Ranch, about 10 miles east of town up in the hills. Old man Crawford went bust 3 years ago, moved back east, never sold the property. It just sits there empty. There's a main house and a barn and a root cellar built into the hillside. Garrett looked at Mercer. You know this place. I've seen it. It's rough country, takes the better part of a day to get there and back. We could organize a group, go out there tomorrow. No, Garrett said firmly. Not a group. If Tate sees a posse coming, he'll kill the boy and run, or kill the boy and fight. But either way, the boy dies. It needs to be small, quiet, careful. You and me. Maybe your deputy if he can keep his head. Charlie straightened his shoulders. I can keep my head, Mr. Garrett. All right then. 3 of us, first light tomorrow. We'll ride out like we're just continuing the search for the boy. Nothing unusual. We'll approach the Crawford place careful, see if there's any sign of occupation. If Tate's there, we'll figure out how to handle it. Mercer nodded slowly. And if he's not there, if we're wrong about all of this, then we keep looking. But Sheriff, we're not wrong. He's here, and he has the boy, and whatever he's planning, it's going to happen soon. I can feel it. They stood together in the empty street, 3 men bound by circumstance into temporary alliance against something they could sense but not see, something that moved in the darkness just beyond the reach of their understanding. Above them, the stars continued their slow wheel across the sky, marking time in the ancient way, indifferent to human fear and human hope and human determination. From the boarding house on the north side of town, a light burned in an upstairs window. Sarah Calloway sat in her son's room, as she had sat every night since his disappearance, waiting for a return she half believed would never come. She did not know about the man who had arrived in town that evening, or about the conversation happening in the street below, or about the plan being formed to search the Crawford ranch. She knew only that her boy was gone and that she would trade any number of tomorrows for one more yesterday with him in it. And somewhere in the hills east of town, in a structure built into the earth itself, hidden from casual view and forgotten by most of the people who had ever known of its existence, a lamp burned low. In its weak light, 2 figures cast shadows on rough stone walls. One was a boy of 14, frightened but unharmed, tied to a support post with rope that allowed him to sit but not stand. The other was a tall man with sandy hair going grey, who sat on a wooden box, reading a book by lamplight, as if he had all the time in the world. Caleb Tate turned a page and continued reading, his face calm and serene, showing nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind his eyes. The boy watched him with the intensity of prey, watching a predator, trying to understand what was coming, when it would come, and whether there was any possible escape. Tate looked up from his book and smiled at the boy. "Won't be long now, Daniel," he said softly. "Just a little while longer, then we'll see what kind of town Cibola Springs really is. We'll see what they're willing to do when they understand what's at stake." The boy said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because fear had taken his voice and left only silence in its place. In the root cellar, the lamp continued burning. Outside, the night deepened toward its darkest hour, that time between midnight and dawn, when the world seems most uncertain and the border between sleep and waking grows thin. In that hour, anything seemed possible, and the worst possibilities seemed most likely of all. The silence and the hunt dawn came to Cibola Springs without ceremony, the sun lifting itself above the horizon with the reluctant determination of something accustomed to making the same journey every day, regardless of what waited below. Mercer stood outside his office, watching the light spread across the town, turning the dust from black to grey to gold, revealing the familiar shapes of buildings that had seemed strange and uncertain in darkness. Garrett emerged from the hotel as the first pink touched the sky, already dressed and ready, his horse saddled and waiting. Charlie Rusk arrived moments later, younger and less certain in the morning light, but steady enough. The 3 men checked their provisions without speaking much, understanding that what lay ahead required preparation more than conversation. They rode east as the town began to wake behind them, past the last scattered houses and into country that grew rougher with each mile. The land rose in uneven waves toward hills that promised nothing but difficulty and distance. Mesquite and scrub oak clung to existence in soil that looked too poor to support anything, and the path they followed was less a road than a suggestion worn into the earth by occasional passage. By mid-morning, they had covered half the distance to the Crawford ranch, and Mercer called a halt to rest the horses. They dismounted in the shade of an outcropping and passed a canteen between them while the animals caught their breath. "Tell me what you know about Tate's history," Mercer said to Garrett. "Everything you've learned." Garrett took a drink and handed back the canteen. "Not as much as I'd like. He was born somewhere in Missouri, had a wife and child once. The wife died in childbirth along with the baby. Something broke in him after that, or maybe it was already broken and that just finished it. He drifted for a while, worked various jobs, nothing that left much of a trail. First time he shows up in any official records is 7 years ago, when he was arrested in Kansas for assault. Served 6 months, got released, disappeared again. After that there's just fragments. A man matching his description wanted for questioning in relation to a murder in Colorado. Another one in New Mexico, always moving, always using different names, always staying one step ahead of anyone looking for him. "And the pattern with the boys?" Charlie asked. "How many times has it happened?" "3 that I can confirm, maybe more. Fort Smith was the first I know about for certain. Then a town called Bellevue in New Mexico territory, about a year ago. A widow's 14-year-old son vanished without explanation. And then 6 months ago, in a settlement near Amarillo. Same thing. Each time, Tate spent a few weeks in town beforehand. Each time he befriended a widow or a woman living alone. Each time the boy was around 14 years old, and each time the boy disappeared and was never found." Mercer absorbed this, his face troubled. "But why? What does he do with them? If he was killing them, surely someone would have found remains. Bodies don't just vanish." "No," Garrett agreed. "They don't. Which means either he's very good at hiding what he does, or he's doing something other than killing them outright. I've thought about it for months, Sheriff. Turned it over in my mind until I thought I'd go crazy with it. Best I can figure is that he takes them somewhere, keeps them alive for a while, and then something. What that something is, I don't know. But whatever it is, it matters to him. It's not random. It's part of some design he's working out." They remounted and continued riding, the conversation dying away as each man retreated into his own thoughts. The sun climbed higher and the heat increased, pressing down on them like something solid. They passed through country that showed no sign of recent human passage, no tracks or markers or evidence that anyone had traveled this way in weeks or months. It was nearly noon when they spotted the Crawford Ranch in the distance, a cluster of structures visible against the hillside like broken teeth in an old skull. They stopped on a rise about half a mile out and dismounted again, using Mercer's field glasses to study the place. The main house was a low adobe building with a collapsed section of roof on the western end. The barn still stood, but listed noticeably to one side. Between them lay a yard overgrown with weeds and scattered with debris. Behind the house, built into the hillside itself, they could just make out the entrance to what must be the root cellar Charlie had mentioned, a dark rectangle cut into the earth. "See any smoke? Any sign of occupation?" Garrett asked. Mercer studied the scene through the glasses, scanning slowly. Nothing. Place looks dead, but that doesn't mean it is. They left the horses tied in a hollow out of sight and approached on foot, moving slow and careful through the scrub. The sun beat down on them without mercy, and sweat soaked through their shirts, but they maintained their pace and their silence, understanding that haste now could mean disaster. When they were within 100 yards of the buildings, Garrett held up a hand and they stopped. He pointed to the ground. There, faint but visible in the dust, were tracks, boot prints, relatively fresh, leading toward the root cellar. The 3 men looked at each other. Mercer drew his weapon and the others followed suit. They moved forward in a spread formation, approaching the cellar entrance from different angles, minimizing the target they presented. The entrance yawned before them, darkness beyond the threshold. They paused at the opening, listening. Nothing. No sound, no movement, no indication of life within. Garrett went in first, moving quickly from light into shadow, his eyes needing a moment to adjust. The cellar opened into a larger space than he had expected, maybe 15 feet square, with rough stone walls and a dirt floor. Support posts held up ceiling timbers. The space was empty, but it had not been empty recently. They could see evidence of occupation scattered around the space. A wooden box that had served as furniture, rope on the ground near one of the support posts, cut ends suggesting it had been removed quickly, an empty tin can that had recently held food. And in one corner, half buried in the dirt floor, a small wooden horse, the kind a boy might carve for himself during long, empty hours. Mercer picked up the horse and turned it over in his hands. Daniel made these. Used to give them to the younger children in town. This is his. So they were here, Charlie said. But where are they now? Garrett was examining the rope, running it through his fingers. This was cut maybe 8 hours ago. After dark last night, probably. He knew we were coming. Maybe he saw something that spooked him, or maybe he's just careful. Either way, he cleared out. They searched the rest of the ranch carefully, but found nothing else. Whatever had happened in that cellar, whoever had been kept there, was gone now, dissolved into the vastness of the territory beyond. When they finally rode back toward Cibola Springs in the late afternoon, they carried with them only the wooden horse and the knowledge that they had been close, but not close enough. The town received the news with a mixture of disappointment and resignation. Sarah Calloway wept when Mercer brought her the carved horse, confirmation that her son had been at the ranch, but was no longer there. The search parties that had been organized and reorganized over the previous days began to lose their cohesion as people returned to their regular work with the understanding that hope was becoming an increasingly expensive commodity to maintain. Garrett spent the next 3 days ranging through the country east of town, following every possible trail away from the Crawford Ranch, but finding nothing. Tate had covered his tracks well, and there were too many directions he might have gone. Too many places to hide in country that seemed designed specifically for concealment. On the 4th day, word came from Fort Stockton. A rider had stopped at a way station 20 miles south of town and asked questions about the country ahead, about towns and settlements and places where a man traveling with a boy might go unnoticed. The description matched Tate. Garrett left immediately. Following this lead south into increasingly desolate country, Mercer stayed in Cibola Springs, maintaining order and trying to comfort Sarah Calloway and dealing with the daily business of keeping a frontier town functioning when grief and fear had taken up residence in its heart. The days became weeks. Summer began its slow transition toward fall, the heat maintaining its grip but with a slightly different quality, a suggestion in the evening air that change was possible even if it wasn't yet present. The town adapted to Daniel Calloway's absence the way communities always adapt to loss, by incorporating it into the routine of existence, making space for sorrow while still attending to the necessities of survival. But Sarah Calloway did not adapt. She kept Daniel's room exactly as he had left it, washed his clothes though he wasn't there to wear them, set a place for him at dinner every evening. People began to talk about her in the careful, worried tones reserved for those who had suffered more than could reasonably be borne. The boarding house continued to operate, but she moved through its rooms like something not quite substantial, a person who had left part of herself somewhere else and couldn't figure out how to retrieve it or accept its loss. Garrett returned after 2 weeks, empty-handed and hollow-eyed. The lead had evaporated in the desert heat, dissolving into rumor and mistaken identity. He stayed in Cibola Springs for 3 more days, interviewing everyone who might have seen or heard anything, going over the same ground that had already been covered, looking for something that everyone else had missed. On the morning of the 4th day, he packed his belongings and prepared to leave. Mercer found him outside the hotel, tying his bedroll to his horse. The sheriff looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier, as if the situation had aged him in ways that went beyond simple time. "Where will you go?" Mercer asked. "Keep following the trail. He's out there somewhere, and sooner or later he'll make a mistake. Everyone does eventually." "And the boy?" Garrett's hands paused in their work. "I hope he's alive. I hope I find him that way. But, Sheriff, you should prepare Sarah Calloway for the possibility that even if we find Tate, we might not find her son, or not find him the way she wants to." Mercer nodded, having already reached that conclusion himself, but finding no comfort in having it confirmed. "If you do find him, if you learn anything, send word, please. The not knowing is eating her alive." "I will. And Sheriff, thank you, for your help, for believing me when you had no reason to. It matters." They shook hands, and Garrett mounted his horse. He rode out of Cibola Springs, heading south, following the same road by which he had arrived, and the town watched him go with the same attention it had given his arrival, understanding that something had shifted, but uncertain of what exactly that shift meant. The weeks stretched into months. Autumn came properly, bringing cooler temperatures and the occasional rain that turned the streets to mud and made everyone remember that the world contained substances other than dust. The search for Daniel Calloway officially ended, though no one made any announcement to that effect. It simply became clear that no organized effort was continuing, that people had returned to their lives, that the boy's disappearance had moved from tragedy to history. But the story didn't end, it transformed. In the saloons of Cibola Springs and the surrounding territory, men began to tell tales of Caleb Tate. The stories grew in the telling, acquiring details and drama that actual events rarely possessed. He became something larger than a man, a figure of dark legend, a name spoken in careful tones. Some said he was a ghost, doomed to wander for his crimes. Others claimed he was hiding in the hills, watching towns from a distance, waiting for his next opportunity. Still, others insisted he had died somewhere in the desert, that the land itself had finally claimed him. Sightings were reported. A man matching Tate's description seen in San Angelo, another in Presidio. A traveler swore he had encountered someone with a boy in the mountains near El Paso, though when pressed for details his story fell apart. Each report was investigated when possible and found to be mistaken or deliberately false, born from the human need to impose story onto mystery. Sarah Calloway's boarding house struggled. Fewer travelers wanted to stay in a place marked by such sorrow, as if grief might be contagious. Eventually, she took in a partner, an older woman named Margaret Price, who had lived in Cibola Springs since its founding. Together, they kept the business operating, though it was clear to everyone that Sarah's heart was no longer in it. She existed rather than lived, moving through her days with the mechanical precision of someone who had forgotten why any of it mattered. Lyle Garrett's letters arrived sporadically, addressed to Sheriff Mercer, postmarked from various towns across Texas and New Mexico territory and beyond. Each letter contained the same essential information. Still searching, no definite leads, will continue. The letters grew shorter and less frequent as time passed, as if Garrett himself was slowly disappearing into the vastness he traveled through. A year went by, then another. Daniel Calloway's disappearance became a story that older residents told to newcomers, part of the town's accumulated history, a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurked in the empty spaces between settlements. The boy himself began to fade from memory for those who hadn't known him well, his face becoming uncertain, his details blurring into a general impression of youth and loss. But Sarah Calloway did not forget. On the anniversary of Daniel's disappearance, she placed flowers on the windowsill of his room. She did this again on his birthday, calculating how old he would have been, imagining what he might look like now, constructing elaborate fantasies in which he had somehow escaped and was living somewhere else, unable to return for reasons that changed depending on her mood. Mercer watched all of this with the helpless concern of someone who understood that certain kinds of pain could not be solved or managed, only endured. He had his own family to think about, his own responsibilities, but Sarah's grief haunted him, a reminder of everything he had failed to prevent or resolve. In the 3rd year after Daniel's disappearance, Mercer received a letter from a marshal's office in Arizona Territory. Lyle Garrett had been found dead in a ravine 20 miles from Tucson. His horse had apparently thrown him, and he had struck his head on a rock. It appeared to be an accident, though given Garrett's profession and purpose, there were those who wondered if Tate had finally caught up to his pursuer rather than the other way around. The letter was formal and brief, containing no speculation, only the facts as they were known. Mercer kept this information to himself for 2 days before deciding that Sarah Calloway had a right to know. He walked to the boarding house on an October evening when the air finally held the promise of winter, and found her in the kitchen preparing dinner for guests who had not yet arrived. She listened to what he had to say without visible reaction, her hands continuing their work, cutting vegetables with steady precision. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "So no one is looking anymore," she finally said. "For Daniel, for Tate, no one. I don't know if anyone else took up the search. It's possible, but the man who was most committed to it, yes, he's gone." She nodded slowly, set down her knife, and dried her hands on her apron. "Thank you for telling me, Sheriff. I appreciate your honesty." He left feeling worse than when he had arrived, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Perhaps because he had delivered the final confirmation that hope was no longer available, even as a possibility, that Daniel Calloway would remain missing and Caleb Tate would remain free, and nothing Mercer or anyone else could do would change either of those facts. The years continued their steady march. Cibola Springs changed in the small ways that all towns change. Some people left and others arrived. Businesses opened and closed. Children were born and old people died, and the cycle of frontier life ground forward with its usual mixture of hardship and occasional joy. The railroad came through 20 miles to the north, bringing new commerce and new people and new ways of thinking. The Comanche trouble that had always lurked at the edges of consciousness finally ended, as that people were forced onto reservations or died or simply gave up fighting a war that history had already decided against them. Mercer grew older, his hair going grey, his joints aching in the morning, his patience for human foolishness wearing increasingly thin. Charlie Rusk eventually left to take a position in San Antonio, replaced by other deputies whose names and faces blurred together in Mercer's memory. Sarah Calloway's hair turned white, and her face acquired deep lines, though she was not yet 50. The boarding house continued operating, but she sold her share to Margaret Price and moved to a smaller house on the edge of town, where she lived alone with her memories and her diminishing hope. The story of Daniel Calloway's disappearance became old news, replaced by fresher tragedies and more immediate concerns. Occasionally, someone would mention it in conversation, usually prompted by something else, the way that old stories resurface when triggered by unexpected associations. But mostly it faded into the background of the town's collective consciousness, remembered but not actively thought about, like an old injury that had healed but left a permanent ache. It was Margaret Price who found the photograph. She had been cleaning out the attic space above the boarding house, sorting through accumulated debris from years of operation, when she came across a small tin box pushed into a corner behind a broken chair. Inside the box were various items left behind by former guests over the years, things of no apparent value, but which had been kept anyway, following the frontier tradition that nothing was truly worthless until proven otherwise. Among these items was a photograph on a tin plate, the kind that had been popular a decade earlier. The image showed a man standing beside a horse, his face visible despite the slight blur that was common to such early photographic attempts. The man was tall and wore a dark coat. Behind him, partially visible, was a boy, young, perhaps 14, his face turned away from the camera as if he had moved at the wrong moment. Margaret brought the photograph to Mercer on a spring morning, when the town smelled of rain and possibility. She set it on his desk without explanation and waited while he examined it. His hands began to tremble slightly as he realized what he was looking at. "Where did you find this?" "In the attic of the boarding house. It must have been left behind by a guest, though I don't know who. But Sheriff, look at the back." He turned it over. Someone had written on the backing in a careful hand, "Crawford Ranch, summer '84. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the date and location were unmistakable. Mercer stared at the photograph for a long time, his mind working through implications and possibilities. The man in the image could have been Caleb Tate, though the quality made certainty impossible. The boy's face wasn't visible, but his size and age appeared right for Daniel Calloway. And if the photograph had been taken at the Crawford Ranch in the summer of 1884, that meant it had been taken exactly when Daniel had been held there. "Who would have taken this?" Margaret asked. "And why?" "I don't know. But Margaret, I need to show this to Sarah. She deserves to see it." They walked together to Sarah's small house at the edge of town, where they found her tending a garden that consisted mostly of rocks and stubborn hope. She straightened when she saw them approaching, her face showing the wary concern of someone who had learned to expect bad news. Mercer held out the photograph without preamble. She took it with hands that had become rough and worn with work and age. She studied it for a long moment, her face unreadable. "Is that him?" Mercer asked gently. "Could that be Daniel?" "I don't know. The face isn't visible, but the size is right. The way he's standing, that's how Daniel used to stand, with his weight on his right leg. And he had a shirt that color. I remember it." Her voice was steady but barely so, control maintained through effort. "Who took this photograph? Why do we have it?" "We don't know. Margaret found it in the boarding house attic. It might have been left by whoever took it, or by Tate himself, or by someone else entirely. But Sarah, the fact that it exists, that means there's physical evidence. A photograph like this doesn't appear by accident. Someone was at that ranch with a camera, someone who saw what was happening there." She looked up at him, and he saw in her eyes something he hadn't seen in years. A small, fragile bloom of hope, dangerous and necessary in equal measure. "What does this mean, Sheriff? Can we find who took it? Can we find out what it shows?" "I don't know, but I'm going to try. After all these years, maybe there's still something that can be learned. Maybe there's still a chance at answers." Sarah Calloway held the photograph against her chest like something precious, and for the first time since her son's disappearance, she allowed herself to believe that the story might not be finished after all. Part 3. The Truth and the Legacy. The photograph changed things in ways that were difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. It sat on Mercer's desk for 3 days, while he stared at it during quiet moments, trying to extract meaning from its blurred surfaces, as if concentration alone could force the image to yield its secrets. The man in the picture might have been Caleb Tate, or might have been any of 1,000 other men who wore dark coats and stood beside horses in that era when such things were common. The boy might have been Daniel Calloway, or might have been any boy of similar age and build, caught in a moment that meant nothing beyond its own occurrence. But the location and date written on the back were specific, and specificity in a case that had consisted mostly of absence and uncertainty felt significant. Mercer began his investigation methodically, the way he had learned to approach problems during his years as sheriff. He started by questioning everyone who might have information about photographers who had worked in the area during the summer of 1884. There had been several itinerant photographers passing through West Texas in those years, men who traveled from town to town, offering to capture families and occasions on tin plates for prices that frontier people could sometimes afford. The first name that emerged was Silas Kincaid, a photographer who had maintained a circuit through the territory during the mid-1880s. Mercer wrote letters to post offices and marshals' stations and anyone who might know Kincaid's current whereabouts. 2 weeks later, he received a response from a town clerk in New Mexico Territory. Silas Kincaid had died 4 years earlier, leaving behind no family and few possessions. His photographic equipment had been sold to settle debts. The second name was Theodore Marsh, who had worked briefly as a photographer before abandoning the profession to become a schoolteacher. Mercer found him in a town called Redemption, about 60 miles south, teaching arithmetic and grammar to children who would rather have been anywhere else. Marsh was a thin man in his 50s with careful hands and a thoughtful manner. He received Mercer in the schoolhouse after classes had ended, offering him coffee that tasted like it had been made that morning and forgotten until now. When Mercer showed him the photograph, Marsh put on spectacles and studied it closely. "I remember this," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Not specifically this image, but I remember the circumstances around when it was taken." Mercer felt something tighten in his chest. "Tell me." Marsh set down the photograph and removed his spectacles, cleaning them with a handkerchief while he organized his thoughts. "This would have been the summer of 1884, as the notation indicates. I was working the circuit through your area, stopping in various towns and ranches, taking photographs of whoever would pay. I had stopped in Cibola Springs for a few days and was preparing to move on when a man approached me at my camp outside town. He offered me $20, which was considerable money then, to ride out to an old ranch and take some photographs. He said he was interested in documenting abandoned homesteads, that he was a collector of such images." "What did he look like?" "Tall, lean, sandy hair that was starting to gray. He had a way of speaking that made you want to trust him, very calm and reasonable. I had no reason to suspect anything unusual about the request, so I agreed. He led me out to what I later learned was the Crawford Ranch. It took most of a day to get there." "Was there a boy with him?" Marsh was quiet for a moment, and in that silence Mercer heard confirmation of what he had both hoped and feared. "Yes, there was a boy. The man said it was his nephew, that the boy was helping him with his research into abandoned properties. The boy didn't speak much, seemed withdrawn, but I attributed that to shyness or simply the reserved nature some young people have." "Did the boy seem afraid? Was he restrained in any way?" "Not that I could see, but Sheriff, understand that I was there for perhaps 2 hours total. I took several photographs of the ranch buildings and the surrounding area. The man asked me to take one of him with his horse, and the boy happened to be standing nearby when I did so. That's the image you have there. After I finished, the man paid me in silver coins, thanked me for my service, and I left. I didn't think anything more of it until weeks later when I heard about a missing boy in Cibola Springs, and even then I didn't make the connection until much later, and by then so much time had passed that I convinced myself I must be mistaken." Mercer set down his coffee cup, which he hadn't touched. "Did you take other photographs that day? Do any of them still exist?" "I kept copies of all my work, a professional habit. When I left photography, I boxed everything up and stored it. The boxes are in my landlady's barn here in Redemption. I haven't looked at them in years, but they should still be there." They walked together to the barn, Marsh moving with the careful steps of someone whose body had begun to remind him of its mortality. The boxes were where he remembered, stacked in a corner beneath a canvas tarp, protected from weather but not from time. Dust covered everything, and the smell of old paper and chemicals filled the space as they opened the containers. Marsh sorted through plates and papers, his fingers remembering the organization system he had used decades earlier. Finally, he extracted a small wooden box and opened it carefully. Inside were perhaps 20 photographic plates, each wrapped in cloth. "These are from that summer," he said. "Let me find the ones from the Crawford Ranch." He unwrapped several plates, holding them up to the light from the barn's open door. The third one made Mercer's breath catch. It showed the entrance to the root cellar, the dark opening into the hillside. And standing just outside that entrance was the same boy from the first photograph, this time facing the camera directly, his features clear, despite the passage of years and the limitations of the medium. It was Daniel Calloway. There was no doubt. Marsh unwrapped 2 more plates. One showed the main house of the ranch, with the boy visible in a window. The other showed the barn and surrounding area, and in the background, barely visible but unmistakable once you knew to look for it, was a figure that might have been Caleb Tate, watching from a distance. "These are the only copies?" Mercer asked, his voice tight. "Yes, the man paid for one photograph, the one you already have. So that's the only one I would have delivered to him. These others I kept for my own records, as I did with all my work." Mercer looked at the images spread before him, evidence of a moment 15 years gone, proof that Daniel Calloway had been at the Crawford Ranch exactly when they had suspected, confirmation of everything they had theorized but could never demonstrate, and yet, paradoxically, proof that somehow changed nothing about the fundamental situation. The boy was still missing. Tate was still gone. The photographs documented a crime but could not undo it. "Mr. Marsh, I need these plates. All of them. They're evidence in an ongoing investigation." "Of course. Sheriff, I should have come forward years ago. I've carried guilt about this for a long time. If there's anything else I can do..." "You've done what you can. The failure here wasn't yours. It was mine, and the laws, and maybe just the nature of the country we live in. Too much space, not enough time, and people who can disappear into the emptiness like they were never there at all." Mercer returned to Cibola Springs with the photographic plates wrapped carefully and secured in his saddlebag. He rode slowly, in no hurry to arrive, understanding that what he carried would reopen wounds that had scabbed over through the application of time and distance. Sometimes the worst thing you could do for a healing injury was to prove that the initial damage had been real. He showed the photographs to Sarah Calloway in the front room of her small house, spreading them on a table that was too fine for its surroundings, a remnant of a life she had lived before. She looked at each image carefully, her face showing nothing, her hands very still. "That's him," she said finally. "That's Daniel. I would know him anywhere. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know this doesn't bring him back. I know it might make things harder rather than easier, but you deserve to know the truth of what happened, as much as the truth can be known." She picked up the photograph that showed Daniel most clearly, the one where he stood outside the root cellar facing the camera. She studied her son's face, the way someone might study a map of a country they had once lived in but could never return to. "He looks afraid," she said quietly. "In this picture you can see it in his eyes. He's trying to hide it, trying to be brave, but he's afraid, and I wasn't there to help him. I didn't even know where to look. There was nothing you could have done. Even if we had known exactly where he was, by the time we got to the Crawford Ranch, Tate had already moved him. He was always one step ahead, and that wasn't your fault or mine or anyone's except his." She set down the photograph and looked at Mercer with eyes that had learned to see past comfortable illusions. "What happens now, Sheriff? Do you reopen the investigation? Do you start searching for Tate again?" "I'll send these photographs to every marshal's office and sheriff's department in the territory. Someone might recognize Tate, might have seen him recently, might know where he went after he left this area. But Sarah, I need you to understand that after 15 years, the chances of finding him, of finding any answers beyond what these photographs show, those chances are small. Not impossible, but small. I understand, but it's more than I had yesterday. Yesterday I had hope and nothing else. Today I have proof that Daniel was alive, that he existed in that moment, that whatever happened to him, he was real, and he was there. That matters. It doesn't heal anything, but it matters." Mercer distributed copies of the photographs as he had promised, sending them out into the network of law enforcement that connected the scattered towns and territories of the West. He included descriptions of Caleb Tate, accounts of his known activities, details of the pattern he had followed. He wrote letters explaining the situation and requesting any information that might lead to Tate's whereabouts or provide closure for the families he had damaged. The responses came back slowly over the following months. Most were negative, offering sympathy but no useful information. A few marshals reported men they had arrested or investigated who might have been Tate, but in each case the connection proved false, built on superficial similarities rather than genuine identification. Then in the late summer of the year, the photographs were discovered. A letter arrived from a sheriff in California. His name was Porter, and he wrote with the careful formality of someone who had learned to document everything because documentation was the only defense against chaos. Sheriff Porter explained that 5 years earlier, a man matching Tate's description had been shot during an attempted robbery in a town called Patience, about 40 miles inland from San Francisco. The man had been traveling with a young person whose age and identity were unclear. During the confrontation, the young person had escaped into the surrounding woods and was never found. The man had died of his wounds 3 days later, refusing to identify himself or explain his circumstances. He had been buried in the town's cemetery under the name John Doe, as was customary for the unidentified. Porter had kept detailed notes on the case, including a description of the dead man that matched Tate closely, down to specific scars and the habit of paying for things in silver coins. He also noted that the man had possessed a locket containing a photograph of a woman and infant, presumably his deceased wife and child. But it was the final paragraph of Porter's letter that made Mercer read it 3 times to be certain he understood correctly. 2 years after the man's death, Porter wrote, a young man had appeared in Patience asking questions about the incident. He was perhaps 19 or 20 years old, thin and marked by obvious hardship, but coherent and determined. He claimed to be searching for information about someone he had traveled with years earlier, someone who had kept him prisoner for months before he managed to escape. The young man had not wanted to provide details or file any official complaint. He had simply wanted to know what had happened to his captor, to confirm that the man was truly gone. When Porter told him about the death and showed him the burial site, the young man had stood there for a long time without speaking, then thanked Porter and left town. Porter had not seen him again. The young man had not given his name, but Porter had noted his features in his records with the thoroughness of someone who documented everything. The description could have matched Daniel Calloway at age 19 or 20. Mercer sat in his office, reading and rereading the letter while the sun moved across the floor and the shadows changed their angles. He thought about certainty and proof, about the difference between what could be known and what could be demonstrated, about the stories people told themselves in order to make sense of circumstances that resisted sense. The man who died in California might have been Caleb Tate. The young man who visited his grave might have been Daniel Calloway. Both propositions seemed possible, perhaps even probable, but neither could be confirmed absolutely. The evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive, the kind of information that satisfied some needs while leaving others unfulfilled. He walked to Sarah Calloway's house as evening was settling over Cibola Springs, bringing with it the cool air that came after hot days and made people remember that the world contained variations. She was sitting on her porch, which was her habit now, watching the street and the sky and whatever thoughts moved through her mind during these quiet hours. He sat beside her and gave her the letter without preamble. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she processed each sentence. When she finished, she folded it carefully and handed it back to him. "Do you think it was him?" she asked. "Do you think Daniel survived?" "I think it's possible. The timeline works, the details align, the description matches what Daniel would have looked like at that age. But Sarah, I can't tell you for certain. No one can. What I can tell you is that it's possible your son escaped, that he survived whatever Tate did to him, that he lived and grew and became a man. Whether that man is alive now, where he might be, why he never came home, those are questions I can't answer. She looked out at the street where the light was fading, her profile sharp against the gathering darkness. Why wouldn't he come home? If he escaped, if he was free, why wouldn't he return to me? I don't know. Shame, maybe, over whatever happened to him during those months. Fear that you wouldn't want him back. Trauma that made it impossible for him to return to his old life. Or maybe he did try to return and couldn't find you. People move, circumstances change, connections break. The frontier is good at separating people who want to stay connected. Or maybe it wasn't him at all. Maybe it was someone else entirely, another boy who suffered under another captor, and I'm just trying to force meaning onto coincidence. Maybe. But Sarah, here's what I believe. I believe your son was taken by a man who did terrible things for reasons we'll never fully understand. I believe Daniel was kept prisoner for several months, that he suffered in ways I can't imagine and don't want to. I believe he eventually escaped, or was released, or somehow got free. And I believe he survived, that he grew into a young man who was strong enough to seek out his captor's grave, to confirm the man was truly gone. Whether that young man was Daniel Calloway or someone else, whether he's alive now or has since died, whether he remembers you or has forgotten everything about his early life, those things I can't tell you, but I believe he survived. I choose to believe that. Sarah was quiet for a long time, so long that Mercer thought she might not respond at all. The street emptied as people went home to their dinners and their families, and the sky deepened from blue to purple to black, and stars emerged like small, hard truths in the darkness. I choose to believe it too, she said finally, not because I can prove it or because the evidence demands it, but because the alternative is too much to carry. I choose to believe my son lived, that he escaped, that somewhere out there he built a life for himself, even if that life couldn't include me. I choose to believe I raised a boy strong enough to survive what should have destroyed him. Is that foolish? No. I think it's the only way any of us get through this. We choose what we can live with, and we build our lives around that choice. They sat together in the darkness, two people marked by their proximity to tragedy, neither able to save the other, but each providing the silent companionship that sometimes matters more than rescue. The town settled into its nightly rhythms around them, and somewhere in the vastness beyond its borders, countless stories were unfolding, some ending in revelation and others in mystery, all of them part of the great unfinished narrative of people trying to make meaning in country that often resisted it. The next morning, Mercer drafted a final report on the case of Daniel Calloway's disappearance. He included all the evidence he had gathered, all the photographs and testimonies and correspondence. He noted the probable death of Caleb Tate in California and the possible survival of Daniel Calloway as indicated by Sheriff Porter's account. He concluded with a statement that the case remained officially open, but that no further active investigation was planned unless new evidence emerged. He filed the report in the cabinet where such things were kept, between records of other crimes and disappearances and unsolved mysteries that marked the progress of frontier justice. Then he locked the cabinet and returned to the daily work of maintaining order in a town that continued needing maintenance regardless of what had come before. Sarah Calloway lived another 12 years, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 61. She had continued her quiet life in the small house at the edge of town, maintaining friendships and attending church and doing the work that needed doing. She never spoke much about Daniel after the day Mercer showed her Sheriff Porter's letter, but she kept the photographs Marsh had taken in a small wooden box beside her bed, and sometimes visitors would find her looking at them with an expression that mixed sorrow and something that might have been peace. In her will, she left instructions that she was to be buried with two objects, her wedding ring and the small carved wooden horse that Mercer had recovered from the Crawford ranch. The instructions were followed, and those who attended her funeral noted that she looked younger in death than she had in her final years of life, as if the act of dying had lifted a weight she had carried too long. Mercer retired 3 years after Sarah's death, handing his badge to a younger man who had the energy and optimism that frontier law enforcement required. He moved to a small ranch north of town where he raised a few horses and read books and tried to learn how to live with the accumulated weight of everything he had seen and done and failed to do during his years as sheriff. He thought about Daniel Calloway sometimes, wondering if the boy had indeed survived, if he had built a life somewhere under a different name, if he had found peace or at least found ways to manage his memories. Mercer wanted to believe that survival was possible, that trauma could be overcome, that people were stronger than the worst things that happened to them. Whether he succeeded in believing this varied from day to day, depending on his mood and the weather and the particular character of his dreams the night before. The story became part of Cibola Springs mythology, told and retold, changing slightly with each telling as all stories do. Some versions emphasize the tragedy, others the mystery, still others the possibility of redemption and survival. The details shifted, but the essential narrative remained. A boy disappeared, a man pursued his brother's killer, a town learned to live with uncertainty, and somewhere in the vastness of the frontier, answers existed that would never be fully known. Years after everyone directly involved had died, a man in his 60s appeared in Cibola Springs, arriving on a train that stopped there briefly on its way to somewhere else. He walked through the town slowly, looking at buildings and streets as if comparing what he saw to some internal map. He visited the cemetery and stood for a long time at Sarah Calloway's grave, though he placed no flowers and spoke no words that anyone could hear. When he left on the evening train, he carried with him whatever knowledge he possessed about his identity and history, leaving behind only questions for those who had noticed his visit and wondered about his purpose. Some thought he might have been Daniel Calloway, returning decades later to see the place he had been taken from. Others dismissed this as wishful thinking, arguing that the man was probably just a former resident revisiting childhood memories or a stranger with no connection to the town's history at all. No one knew for certain, and no one ever would. The man boarded the train, and it carried him away into the distance, where such questions dissolved into the general mystery of existence, lost among the countless other stories of people whose lives brushed against each other briefly, before diverging into separate futures that would never intersect again. In the end, that was perhaps the most honest conclusion available. Not resolution, but acceptance. Not answers, but the acknowledgement that some questions would remain open, regardless of how much time passed or how diligently people searched for closure. The frontier had always been a place where people disappeared and sometimes reappeared, and often simply vanished into the space between known points, becoming rumors and stories rather than confirmed facts. Cibola Springs continued, as towns do, incorporating its history into its present, building new stories on top of old ones, forgetting some things and remembering others according to the mysterious calculus by which communities decide what matters. The story of Daniel Calloway's disappearance survived in the town's collective memory, not because it was resolved, but because it represented something essential about the experience of living in that time and place. The fragility of safety, the persistence of hope, and the necessity of continuing forward even when the past remained unfinished. The sun rose and set over the town, as it always had, indifferent and reliable, marking time in the ancient way. The land endured, the people adapted, and somewhere in the vastness of memory and possibility, a boy who had been taken and might have survived carried his story forward into whatever future remained available to him, leaving behind only fragments and suggestions for those who came after, evidence of existence but not explanation, presence but not conclusion. That was enough. It had to be. In a country built on movement and change, and the constant negotiation between what was known and what was possible, it was all that could reasonably be expected. The story ended not with certainty, but with continuation, not with answers, but with the quiet persistence of questions that mattered precisely because they remained open, inviting each person who encountered them to decide for themselves what truth they could live with, and what hope they could maintain in the face of permanent uncertainty. The frontier accepted all of it. The tragedy and the mystery, the survival and the loss, the searching and the never quite finding. It had room for every version of every story, for all the possible endings and the indefinite middles, for the known and the unknown existing side by side in the same vast space where anything could happen and most things went unwitnessed and unrecorded. And in that acceptance, perhaps, lay whatever wisdom the story had to offer, that some journeys end without reaching their destinations, that some questions remain valuable, even unanswered, and that the act of continuing forward despite uncertainty might be the closest thing to victory that most people ever achieve.